This tutorial is part of our full-stack React Django DRF channels project, DJ Chat. You can watch this tutorial and many more from our YouTube course playlist, or the whole course, including access to additional resources from our Udemy course. The Udemy course link, which provides the best price for the course, is in the video description. So we're just continuing the theme of documenting our code. We're now going to move back to Swagger UI and just make sure, or just start to update the interface so that we can document our progress so far and potentially start to interact with our data through the Swagger UI interface. First of all, then, let's take a look at where we got to with Swagger UI and the schema. So I've headed across to 127.0.18000/API just to remind ourselves of where we're going to find the UI interface. And I think it's API doc schema. That's the schema. So the UI then, I don't think it's here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So API doc schema UI. And here we go. So we do have an additional endpoint being detailed here. So we can use a drop down. Notice that the reason why I showed you how to use doc types or include doc type, because it can be included, or the additional information can be added right here, and that can be useful to help you understand how to interact with this endpoint. Now, one of the problems, or something that is missing at the moment, is that it specifies there are no parameters for this endpoint, which we know there are because we've already detailed them here and have already created them in the view. So the question is, how do we get from no parameters to all the parameters to be able to try this out and actually utilize this interface to test our endpoint with different parameters? So first up, we're going to create a new file called schema.py inside the server folder. Now, this additional information that we're going to describe can go into the view, but it is already quite a large view and can be a little bit cumbersome once we add this additional information, because it is quite a lot of information we're adding. So I've created a new file here called schema, which is obviously related to the schema, additional schema data, metadata. And now we're going to go ahead and start to describe the different parameters that can be passed into the view. And then this additional information will be used on the front end of Swagger UI so that we can interact with the view, utilizing the Swagger UI interface. So let's go ahead and give this a go. So what I'll do here, because we have quite a few to do, once I've shown you how to do one of them, you'll be able to then just copy and paste and change it. So I'll show you one example. I'll then copy and paste all the other examples in and just specify any differences in them. And then you can go ahead and have a go if you like. So from DRF. Now, what I say, if you like, you might want to skip this or just copy and paste this from the example file. But what we're doing here then, we're going to import extend schema and the OpenAPI parameter. Then we're also going to need, just drop this across. So we're also going to need DRF spectacular .type, so we can specify the types of data that we're working with. Import OpenAPI types. There we go. Okay, so from .serializer, we're going to need to, maybe that should be serializers rather than serializer. Maybe we want to change that. Typically, serializers were plural rather than singular. So from serializer, import server serializer. Going to need that, and the maybe the channel serializer, we might need that too. Right, so let's go ahead and call this list server docs. So that's just a reference to the server list. Maybe we should call it server list. Server list docs, a reference to the fact that this is extending some metadata to describe the parameters that can be passed into this list here. And I think that's why, yeah, so let's call it server list docs. This is, I think, why I called it list server first, because we're referring specifically to a list. But we'll call it this for now, and then we'll go ahead and extend schema. Let's go ahead and specify the serializers that we're using. So this is going to be the server serializer. Many equals true. Yep. Okay, so now we're just going to specify the parameters that we can pass in. So the first one was category. That's the first parameter that we set up. So let's define our parameters equals. So we need square brackets, and then let's go for the OpenAPI parameter to define a new parameter. And then let's go ahead and give this a name. So name equals category. That's the first one we did. Category. Then we're going to need maybe a type. So type equals type of data. Open API types dot string. Okay, can't see anything. So that defines the data parameter type, or the data type of the parameter that we pass in. And then we can go ahead and maybe add a description if we like. So description equals category of servers to retrieve. There we go. A comma on the end. At the end. So it formats nicely for us. There we go. So now we need to define the fact that we're creating a parameter which is part of the query string of a URL. So here, for example, here we've created some parameters here, and it's part of the URL. So we have to specify that. So we need to specify OpenAPI parameter query. So that can be done through location equals OpenAPI parameter dot and then query. Maybe you want to add that before the description. There we go. Right, so let's go back into our views now and let's import this in. So from .schema, let's import this in. That was server list docs. And now we can use this as a declarator for our function. So if you go down to the function here, we can declare this now with @server list docs. Let's take a look at this in the browser now. So if I refresh and just drop down the server, we now have some parameters. And the first one here is the category. So what we can do is select try this out. So let's return all these servers related to category number 1. We'll execute, and we can see that we've not returned anything. Now, of course, the reason why that is because we're not returning it by ID. Let's not forget that. We're returning category by cat name. And of course, all we need to do, if we're not too sure, is go back up here and have a look at our documentation. So filter servers by category name. So that's what we need to pass in, the category name, instead of just number 1. So let's go for cat1. Let's execute that again. And this time we return the correct data, which is all good. And you can see here we are provided the URL, which can be useful when building our API. So building the front end, where to send the data, as well as actually creating the string that we need to request the specific data. That can be useful. So hopefully you can start to see how this can be quite useful to test the endpoint. If you go down a little bit here, we've got some response headers, which can be useful, as well as having a look at the data that is returned here, or the expected values. This, of course, is all very useful information if we were a front-end developer and needed to interact with the API. We've pretty much got all the information here that we're going to need in order to build the front end and define the correct parameters and endpoints to return the data that's required to build the front end interactions. So at this point, what we need to do now is, of course, create a schema entry for all of these parameters. Now, like I said, I won't do that step by step because that'll take couple of minutes. So I will just copy and paste some code in. Now, what you can also do potentially is ask ChatGPT to build this for you. If you pass in what you currently have and then show it a new statement, or just show it the whole view, potentially it will create the whole list for you. So I'm just going to get cracking. So you are going to need a comma right there. So the next one I brought in here is the quantity. Remember, this is going to be an integer. Again, it's going to be the OpenAPI parameter query and number of servers to retrieve. Same again then for the user, so by user. So that's going to return by user. If we pass in true, we can then add in, for example, by with num members. So we can return the number of members. That's a Boolean this time. We also have, I think, by server ID. Yep. So let's bring that in. There we go. So that's by server ID. We're going to pass in an integer, include server by ID. So that pretty much summarizes the 5 parameters that we have now created in our filter. So now it's just a case of going ahead and testing that out. So I'll just refresh this interface. So we should now see all the different interactions, the parameters here. Looks like we do. Let's just zoom out a little bit. So we can go ahead and try that out. And so let's go for server by ID. So you can go ahead and test this out. So that's the server by ID there. Let's go ahead and make sure that by user, true. So return all the servers related to users. It says incorrect authentication credentials. That's interesting. Maybe we're not logged in. So it does look like we're going to need to log in. I assumed we were. So what we do here then is we'll just localize this code here. So we'll remove this, just comment this out. Let's go and check the user right here. So if by user and not request dot user is authenticated, then and if they are authenticated. So if the user, if we have passed in true Boolean, and then we've gone ahead and checked the user's logged in. Remember here we're utilizing the default session authentication. That's what we set up. So if we have passed in by user and they are logged in, then we go ahead and do that. Else we go ahead and raise the authentication failed. So else, let's raise authentication failed. And then we need to do the same thing again for the server ID if you wanted to adapt that to make sure that the user is logged in before they can access the server by ID. So let's try that again. So try this out again. So this time I'm going to select Boolean true by user. Let's execute. Looks like we've still got incorrect authentication credentials provided. So what we can do here is we can copy this URL because we can still utilize, and it looks like we've still got the same problem. So we'll help if we logged in, of course. Now, I promise I was logged in before. I haven't just logged out there. So let's try that again. So I'm now logged in. It does work. So let's try that again up here. So we'll execute that again. And it looks like we're returning the data. Good. Right, so that looks like it's working okay. So I've gone ahead and added the if not request. If so, if the user's not logged in, we're just going to raise the authentication failed if they try to utilize by server ID. So I'll quickly log out and try this out. So let's just cancel that and try this out. So let's try and get server by ID. Remember, I'm not logged in. So here I return incorrect authentication credentials. So let's just log in again, make sure it works. Execute that again, and this time I'm now retrieving the information. Some small changes here just to make sure that users are logged in before they can access some of these different filters. I won't test them all out, but by all means, go ahead and experiment and have a look at some of these different options. If you can think of some other options that you might want to include and return data related to the servers, go ahead and see if you can adapt some of the code to return some of that information, and then add some more metadata into the schema to see if you can then get the parameters to be displayed here in the documentation. Now, something you might have a little bit of time for is to think about refactoring the code. Can the code be presented in a more readable way? For example, at least according to ChatGPT, of course. So what we're going to do is I'm going to paste in the function that we just created, or the class I think that we just created, and then I'm going to ask it to refactor code. I should have said that first. See what it's got. So here's the refactor version. So it's going to show you a copy of your code. So once it's finished, it's going to give you a list of the different points or the different parts of the code that has been refactored. So you can see here that the list method has been separated from the query set logic and moved to the end of the class. So what's done here is it's moved everything into the get query set function. So related to actually building the query set, which is interesting. And you can see what's actually inside of the view is just the query set and the serializer. So that's a move that potentially you might want to take. The query set logic has been moved yet. Attributes have been named. So there were some naming conflicts that have been changed. The query set variable has been renamed query set to make it clear that it's a query set. Okay, and then the order of the query set filters have been changed to match the new order of the query parameters. Okay, so it's made some changes here. It's hard to really appraise whether that's going to be more readable to or for you, but that's definitely an interesting way of approaching this. And of course, what you can now do is ask ChatGPT to refactor it again, or you can ask it not to do it in that way or show it a different way of refactoring. And by doing that, it does give you some different considerations, because what I'll be doing now is asking myself, well, actually, what is the get query set? How does it relate to the view set? Is that going to be relevant and appropriate to use with a view set, for example? So there's lots more questions that can be derived from that. And this is where you're going to potentially start to learn a little bit more and look at how one can format or present the code. Now let's remember what we're trying to achieve when presenting code. We're trying to make it readable and understandable. You need to ask yourself, does it make it more understandable that we've separated the code which was related to the list function into a new function here? So does that make sense? Maybe it doesn't in relation to what we've done so far, but if you started to utilize some of the other methods that are available in the view set, then potentially that's going to fragment the code and make it harder for you to read. So by having all this code that we initially placed inside of a list, it does localize it to this function and make it part of this function. So potentially it makes it then easier to read the code. So by having it all here in this function, potentially that makes it easy to identify the fact it's part of the list function rather than to separate it from the list into a new function. And like I said, if we start to add some more functions here related to the view set, that could complicate matters. Unless, of course, we wanted to reuse this code in other functions. I think this comes back to strengths and weaknesses. There's always strengths and weaknesses in different approaches. It's about trying to identify what maybe works best for you sometimes, or potentially what works best for your team in terms of presenting code. So if you're interested, I have gone ahead and just copy and pasted the code that was generated by ChatGPT. Now, this is a ChatGPT version 4. No doubt it will get better, but at the moment I find that it does make a few mistakes, and there is a mistake here. It's forgotten that the with number members was needed here in the list view. It has moved it to the get query set, and that is one of the problems that you're going to have. So it will break the code if you use the example, and we would need to then work out how to make sure that we could access with num members in the list function. So that is something that we can ask ChatGPT to do. We could ask it to then to refactor again, but this time make sure that you can access this. And obviously we could potentially move the serializer into the query set, get query set function. That's something we can do, but that's just something to consider if you are using ChatGPT, that it doesn't always work. And this again is where effective testing definitely comes in handy. Okay, so we're just going to stick with what we've got so far. By all means, have a look at some of the refactoring options. Let's go back to where we were. There we go. Oh no, that's not right. There we go. So I've just moved it back to where we were. So no changes have been made, except I think I have moved quantity at the bottom here, because just in case we do try to use by server ID and then quantity, we shouldn't do, because by server by ID, that should just return one server by default. But again, that is something that we need to consider here. You know, what if we were going to test this filter, we would need to seriously consider the flow and putting in place preventions to avoid certain combinations. And this is where the complexity of something like this starts to arise. The fact that potentially by adding more options, we add more potential problems. And that in turn then extends the testing, or extends the amount of testing that we need to do.